Good afternoon. Welcome to the Pacific Regions Forum on Business and Management Communication. I'm Rosalie Tong, Professor of International Business and Associate Director of the David Lamb Center for International Communication. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Masud Chan, who is an Assistant Professor of International Business and a Faculty Fellow at the Barton School of Business in Wichita State University, Wichita, Kansas. Professor Chan completed his PhD in International Business from Simon Fraser University in 2009, I believe so many years ago. His work has previously been published in Thunderbird International Business Review, the Journal of Trust Research, International Business Review, Advances in International Management, and Asia Pacific Business Review. Dr. Chan's presentation today is entitled Diasporas as Drivers of National Competitiveness, Trade, Trust, and Ties. His presentation will be followed by the question and answer period. Without further ado, I'll turn the podium to Masud.
Thank you very much for coming. The David Lamb Center and Simon Fraser University and Professor Rosalie Tong for inviting me to give this talk. Diasporas have been one of my research areas for a while, so I'm always very interested to talk a little about the diaspora. This is what I will be talking about today. I'll start by talking about what a diaspora is historically, what it meant, and how that definition has changed. I'll then look at some of the modern, more prominent diasporas. I'll talk about why diasporas have become more important and what roles they play. I'll talk specifically about how diasporas foster trust. And finally, I'll talk about some of the challenges that are emerging for diasporas. So diaspora, it derives from a Greek word that means a scattering or sowing of seeds. Historically, it referred to the spread of an ethnic group outside of its country of origin. And usually, this was meant to talk about Jews who had been driven out of the historic land of Israel. So if you look at the historic definition of diasporas, one of the things you'll see is it talks about, the idea is there is some sort of violent dispersal or some sort of event that has forced people outside of their homelands. But increasingly what we see is this definition is beginning to change. And we now talk about diasporas as people or a group of people who are living outside of their country of origin for a long time. It doesn't always have to be a violent event that has driven them out. But the idea is that in a lot of cases, the feeling of a diaspora can come from a belief of distinctiveness in their country of residence. It could be a belief of shared identity or a belief in a shared common fate that leads people to believe they are a part of a diaspora. Some of the modern diasporas that are prominent and have large numbers are the Chinese diaspora. And of course, the numbers for the Chinese diaspora are, there's a lot of dispute as to what the real number is, but at the lower end, we are looking at about 30 million, and at the upper end, we talk about as much as 60 million. The Indian diaspora, anywhere from 20 to 30 million. Another very prominent diaspora, the Lebanese diaspora, anywhere from 10 to 15 million. So we actually have quite a bit of variation as to how you define a diaspora. But in any case, the important thing is all of these are large, prominent diasporas with a widespread outside of their home country. To give a little bit of idea as to the numbers that we are talking about, if we take the upper figure for the Chinese diaspora, we are talking about there are more Chinese actually living outside of China than French in France. So that's the number of people we are actually talking about. I'll quickly go on and talk a little bit about these diasporas and as to what they have done for their home countries and host countries. If you start with the Chinese diaspora, actually the largest diaspora in numbers probably in the world, but it is somewhat less spread out than some of the other diasporas I'll be talking about. Of the roughly Between 35 to 60 million that we are talking about, the overwhelming majority are found in Southeast Asia. So in terms of numbers, the largest concentration of overseas Chinese would be found in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, roughly about 8 million people of Chinese descent in each of these countries. One of the things that distinguishes the Chinese diaspora is the ties that migrant Chinese have built up with their homeland and the amount of trade that often takes place through these informal networks. And while figures are sometimes hard to come by, it is estimated that after China's opening in 1979, of all the foreign direct investment that has actually come into China, a conservative estimate is that about half of it was actually done by the overseas Chinese themselves. I'll next talk a little bit about the Indian diaspora. Between 20 to 30 million. The Indian diaspora is somewhat more spread out geographically than the Chinese diaspora. If you look at the Indian diaspora, the second highest concentration of Indians outside of India is in the United States. So the highest concentration is found in Nepal, about 4 million, but after that, the second highest is the United States, and the UK is in the top 5 as well. So it's a little bit more spread out. But one of the key distinctions that we see from a trade perspective between the Indian and the Chinese diasporas is historically the Indian diaspora has not been a big trading diaspora, at least not to the same extent as the Chinese diaspora. If we go back and talk about foreign direct investment figures, what we see is whereas roughly half of China's foreign direct investment was from its diaspora, in India's case that was about 10 to 15%. So the absolute numbers in direct investment are quite a bit lower. And of course, I mean, India's actual foreign direct investment attraction is also quite a bit lower than China's. But one of the things that the Indian diaspora has been known for is that it has been known for, especially in the West, for being a more professional diaspora, as opposed to more of a trade and business-oriented diaspora that we often associate the Chinese diaspora with. To put that into perspective, there are some estimates that in the United States, 1 out of all 10 physicians is either Indian or of Indian origin. So that gives you an idea of the level of the professionalism, the professionals associated with being in the Indian diaspora. I'll quickly move on to the Lebanese diaspora. And the Lebanese diaspora, of course, derives from a great trading heritage, trading and seafaring heritage, going back thousands of years. In fact, even today, and actually let me go back a little, one of the reasons I am going to talk a little bit about the Lebanese diaspora is because when I moved to Wichita, I didn't associate Wichita with much of a diaspora of any kind. But in Wichita, the Lebanese diaspora is extremely prominent. And in a city like Wichita, it's not much bigger than 500,000 people. Some of the most prominent business people and professionals are Lebanese. So that's one of the reasons why I'm looking a little more at the Lebanese diaspora. It's a great tradition of seafaring and trading. Even today, when I talk to some people of Lebanese origin, some of them would say, well, I come from Phoenician stock. So the first time I heard that, I actually went back and checked history books just to make sure I knew what they were talking about. But I mean, a great trading heritage. The Lebanese diaspora probably is the most spread out, I would say, of all the diasporas that, the modern diasporas that we can think of. The Lebanese diaspora, between 12 and 15 million, to put that into perspective, the population of Lebanon is about 5 million, or even a little less than 5 million. So we have a much larger proportion of people claiming Lebanese heritage outside of Lebanon than we actually have in Lebanon. The Lebanese diaspora are very prominent in Lebanon because a lot of the funds for reconstruction of Lebanon flow through the Lebanese diaspora. A lot of this money actually is often classified as foreign direct investment, but most of the Lebanese would tell you it is less foreign direct investment, and it has more to do with people sending money to their families to start businesses per se. So that was about the Lebanese diaspora, very spread out. One of the interesting things about the Lebanese diaspora is of the roughly 15 million, about 6 to 7 million are found in one country, which is Brazil. The Lebanese diaspora is fairly prominent in countries like Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and so on. And finally, I'll go back and talk about sort of the diaspora that was considered the classical diaspora, which is the Jewish diaspora. So it is concentrated fairly heavily in the United States and in Western European countries like France, and also countries like the United Kingdom and Canada. Historically, a community that has been very successful professionally, and also increasingly, we begin to see a more business-oriented approach, especially in the political sphere. One of the things that, of course, people would notice is the first three diasporas that I talked about are essentially national groups, whereas the last one that I talked about is more of a religious group or ethnic group. So this also should give you an idea of the difficulties we sometimes have in classifying what a diaspora is, because some people would say, well, do you really think it is fair to compare a country origin group with a religious group? And it is a debate. One of the more recent developments that we see in this field is a lot of Africans are now beginning to talk about how to utilize the African diaspora in helping drive development in the continent of Africa. Whereas, of course, even that term by itself creates controversies. Because I've seen people who say, well, it's hard to talk about an African diaspora because how do you really classify who is an African? Is it because you ask them what they are? Do actually a lot of people consider themselves to be a part of an African diaspora as opposed to a Nigerian diaspora, and so on? So these are some current controversies, minor controversies I should add, in the field, but it tells you a little bit about the difficulty that we have in classifying what a diaspora actually is. Next, I'll move on to talk about why are diasporas becoming important. I mean, diasporas have existed for thousands of years. They have traded with their countries of origin. They have opened ties, not only trade-related ties, but also political ties between the two countries. But today, diasporas are becoming even more important for a number of reasons. First of all, it is becoming easier to move across borders. And because of that, we have far more people who are actually moving from one country to another. In 2008, the United Nations estimated that about 200 million people are actually living in a different country than the country they were born in. So that would give you an idea as to the extent of migration that we see today. And the example that I'm about to give, that's more of a unique case, but still to put a little bit of political reality onto it. By some estimates, 1 out of every 8 people born in Mexico live in the United States. So that's maybe a different type of diaspora, but still, I mean, the ease of movement that we see today. Of course, in the case of the US and Mexico, we are seeing efforts to reduce this ease by quite a bit. But people actually move fairly frequently now. Another reason to go with the ease of movement is how easy it has become to keep in touch with families and friends back home. So when we thought of diasporas classically, we would think about people sometimes coming to the new world, leaving behind their family and friends and starting a new life in a new country. But that is no longer true anymore. People are much better able to keep in touch with their families and friends back home. So we have this whole new group of people living in different countries who also actually maintain, in some cases, fairly strong ties with their countries of origin. The next major theme that we have is the rise of what we call brain circulation. Historically, the term that we used was brain drain. The idea that educated people from developing countries, after finishing their education, would move to a developed country and stay there. And it was, of course, a brain drain because these were people trained by the poorer developing countries, and their brains were being lost to developed countries. And that, of course, was the dominant theme in the post-World War II era, 50s, 60s, and 70s. But starting in the 90s, things began to change somewhat. And we saw the rise of what's called brain circulation, which is people who had originally come to a developed country with the intention to stay started moving back to their countries of origin. So for example, we could have someone from India who moved to the United States to complete a graduate degree, come to the country, come to the United States in the 80s or 90s, decide to immigrate and stay back. And that would be classical brain drain. But increasingly, we are beginning to see some of these people decide maybe our professional and maybe personal interests are better served going back to India. And that, of course, is the rise of brain circulation. To put that into perspective, I recently saw some figures that said that in the last 10 to 15 years, about 500,000 ethnic Chinese have returned from the United States to China. Which brings me to my third point, which is the emerging war for talent. And what we see today is, in some ways, it is a war for qualified people in different fields, in science, technology, business, also people with cultural savvy to operate in different environments. We see countries like China and increasingly India trying to engage their diasporas and trying to attract them back home to help in the economic development in their home countries. But at the same time, we see that in developed countries there is also a push to retain educated, qualified people. A couple of days ago, I was watching a Republican primary debate about the different candidates. And while no one can accuse any of them of being immigrant or soft on immigration, one of the striking things was almost all the people on the stage agreed that people who were doing graduate science and technology degrees in the United States should be allowed to actually stay back. I remember Governor Mitt Romney saying something like, if it were up to me, I'd staple a green card to every master's or PhD diploma in science and technology, because we want these people to stay back in this country. So that is the extent of the emerging war for talent that we are talking about, for people who have degrees in highly wanted disciplines. Countries are going all out to attract them. And while we often talk about the classical settler societies like the United States or Canada, one of the things to notice is that countries that historically have not been immigrant or settler societies are kind of beginning to get in on this game. For example, a country like Spain now has a fairly strong program to attract people with degrees in science and technology. And while that by itself should not be a big surprise, it is a surprise because Spain historically was not an immigrant society per se. Even a country like Britain actually has programs to attract highly skilled individuals. And I say and talk about these programs above and beyond the normal programs a lot of these countries have for immigration. So we actually are in this war for talent. And to quickly move on to a slightly different but related topic to talent, what we also see is overall the world is beginning to age. We see people living longer. Generally in the world, with some exceptions, we have people having lesser children, which means A, people are getting older, and B, there are less people coming into the workforce. So that kind of makes the emerging war for talent even more intense. Next, I move on to talking about the rise of ethnic professional associations. In Western countries, a lot of help that diasporas get is from their ethnic kin who are in different professional bodies. One of the best known of these is the Indian professional grouping known as the Indus Entrepreneur. It goes by its acronym TIE. TIE has chapters in most major American and Canadian cities, and fairly recently they actually started a chapter or a couple of chapters in Britain as well. So these are professional groupings of Indians who help mentor people coming into the profession. They sometimes help Indians moving to the United States or Canada, sort of help integrate in society. And while I talk about TIE, there are others, for example, the Silicon Valley Chinese Engineers Association or the Korean IT Forum. They serve fairly similar purposes. They train and mentor new ethnic kin and help them move up the ranks. And because we have more and more of these ethnic professional associations that are being formed in different countries, and because these associations actually have a lot of informal power, because they bring together a lot of brains per se, we are seeing more and more of the importance of diasporas, because diasporas are often driving these ethnic professional associations. And finally, the last reason I'll point to as to why diasporas are becoming more important is we see increasing efforts by the countries of origin of these diasporas to engage them. China, of course, was a pioneer in this regard. Even before the Communist Party actually took power in China, they had an overseas affairs committee within the Communist Party, which was dedicated to outreach to overseas Chinese. And in 1949, there was the overseas ministry, the overseas Chinese ministry or department was formed, which at least theoretically had the same importance as the foreign ministry. Might not be actually what happened, but at least in theory they were equals in that regard. And China, of course, has been very successful, I would say, in engaging with its diaspora. As I said, at least half of investments into China have come from overseas Chinese. You contrast that with a country like India, another big diaspora nation, but which historically took a completely opposite approach to engaging with the diaspora. India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, told the Indian diaspora that they should associate only with their countries of residence, not with India. And the logic was, going back in time, this was the late 40s and early 50s, Cold War at its height. India was trying to position itself as a leader of the non-aligned movement. So they wanted to make sure that India wasn't accused in any way of using its diaspora to try to control or influence newly independent third world countries. So that was the historic Indian model. That changed in about the year 2000, when a new approach by the Indian government was adopted, to some extent based on the experience of the Chinese government. Active engagement with the Indian diaspora, celebrating the achievement of overseas Indians, trying to foster greater links between India and its overseas community. Is sort of not exactly a sort of a person, let me go back a little. They started what's called a person of Indian origin card, which later became overseas nationality. So people of Indian origin in different countries could apply for that, and essentially they could get all the rights of citizens except for voting. So that was an effort by the Indian government to actually engage further with its diaspora. So you put all of that together, what you see is an atmosphere where the diaspora is actually becoming more important globally. And of course, this brings me to the point that historically diasporas were looked at as people who were sort of victims, people who had been driven out of their country of origin, cut off from the motherland, and so on. And that was the classical view, but increasingly, we see that diasporas are now beginning to be seen as sort of bridges or bridge builders between the country of origin and the country of residence, as people whose networks in both these countries help drive trade and investment between the two countries. So let's look at some of the key roles of the diaspora. First of all, we have diasporas as drivers of trade and investment. I talked about the Chinese diaspora and investment, so I'll not go into that anymore. But essentially what we do see is, you talk to business people, they'll say, when I expand to a different country, what I'm looking for is people I can trust. And usually, people often find ethnic kinsmen in different countries, at least starting out, as more trustworthy. That, of course, doesn't mean that they're the only people who are trustworthy, but instinctively we do have the idea of trying to associate with people who are like us, as we define us to be. And that means people often associate with ethnic kinsmen, and these networks often help drive trade and investment between different countries. Before I move into that, let me provide a quick example. In 2008, a survey was done about Indian IT companies, startup IT companies in India. And the survey found that 88% of all Indian startup companies in India actually maintained close links with diaspora Indians in the United States, mostly, but not exclusively, in the Silicon Valley. So almost every startup company either sourced production or ideas, or sometimes had people coming in from diaspora Indians. In fact, more than 50% of Indian IT startups were founded by Indians who had spent at least a few years living in the United States. So that's the extent of how the diaspora helps drive trade and investment. Next, we look at how technology can be transferred and capacity, and by capacity I mean institutional capacity, is developed with the help of the diaspora. Once more, if we look at the experience of some major developing countries, what we see is a lot of technology transfer occurs through diaspora networks. And one of the reasons for that is a lot of companies that might be foreign companies but have locals or ethnic kin in key positions of authority are often trusted more by locals. So for example, if I give the example of India, in India, if we have an American company operating, but one of the key senior managers is Indian, chances are there will be more trust by locals towards that subsidiary. And that sort of trust, to some extent, helps reduce what's called the liability of foreignness, which is the idea that companies find it difficult to do business in a third country or in a foreign country because they suffer from a liability of being foreign. If you have people in key decision-making positions, this liability of foreignness goes down if those people actually have a background in the country you're operating in. Third, we look at what's called the nation brand, and this is a fairly recent concept. The idea being that every country has a brand of its own. When you think of a country, you often associate something with that country. And the first few things that come to mind about a country when you think of it, that essentially is the nation brand of that country. And the diaspora plays an important part in helping drive this nation brand, in most cases, in a positive direction. So if we think of a country like France, for example, and let me sort of throw out this question to the audience. When I say France, what are some things that immediately come to mind? What comes to mind when we say France, when I say France?
Wine, cheese. Yeah.
Sorry? Wine, cheese. And women's fashions. And of course, I mean, all of that is fairly normal. I mean, when you talk of France, people talk about high fashion, they talk about high quality food. So that essentially is the nation brand of France. When we talk about China, people have different images as well. And that essentially is the nation brand of China. Now, to put that into perspective, not all nation brands are positive. Sometimes nation brands are negative. Sometimes in the case of some countries, you can have positives and negatives existing side by side. So if you ask some people, the brand of China is associated with rapid economic growth. But it might also be associated with political repression. So it depends on who you ask. But the important thing is the nation brand can have a number of different things existing side by side. And one of the things diasporas do is they help to drive the nation brand in the country in which they live. And I go back to an example of an Indian company that launched Titan watches. And Titan watches, when they started selling them in the West, they used to say Titan is a global watch. But nowadays they're comfortable saying it's an Indian watch. And to some extent that is because the perception of India, some would say, has improved in Western countries. To some extent that improvement is due to the efforts of the diaspora. A few months ago, I was at an event in Wichita where the Indian ambassador to the United States was speaking. And one of the things that he said that really struck me was when he said, I'm an ambassador to the United States, but I come and I go in a few years, so does every other ambassador. But the real ambassadors of India to the United States are the Indians who live in the United States, because that is through whom you actually see India, and that is probably what you associate India the most with, the people you interact with. So, diaspora, great role in driving the image of the country, of their home country, in the country they live in. As I said, this does not always have to be positive. You go to Britain today and talk to people of Pakistani origin who live in Britain, and they'll tell you after the terrorist attacks in Britain in 2006 that were conducted by ethnic Pakistanis, the image of Pakistan has suffered tremendously in Britain. And of course, that has to do with diaspora actions as well. So usually, when I talk about the image, I'm usually talking about positive things, but it is important to realize that in some cases, the diaspora can also lower the image of your country in a different country, so something to keep in mind as well. Diasporas often help facilitate cross-national trade through the transnational networks that we have. And for a lot of people who are or who consider themselves in many cases multicultural, people who have lived in different countries, even they have a hard time figuring out the idea that if you have friends from a number of different ethnicities, if you have friends from a number of different countries you can call or email fairly regularly, that actually makes you a very unusual type of person. For people who actually do that, for them it is perfectly normal. But if you look at figures, that's not common. That's actually fairly uncommon, people who are a part of so many different types of networks. So it is people who live in different countries but have family, friends in their country of origin who can help drive trade because they have access to transnational social networks. If you talk to businessmen who do business in, let's say, the Silicon Valley, one of the things they would say is, it is so simple for me to simply pick up the phone and call someone in India and say, where are you with the development of this? Or when can you send me the delivery of these items? And these things can also be done, of course, without the networks, but they tend to be much more difficult and more time-consuming. In a study by Saxenian, she found that for every 1% increase in immigration to California from any given country, California's trade with that country goes up by 0.5%. So there seems to be a fairly strong link between migration from a particular country and trade and investment with that country as well. And finally, the institutional and human capital development that we see in the country of origin. For people who move back to their countries of origin, one of the things they often bring back with them is ideas. And some of these ideas do not sound much sitting in a developed country, but they're fairly revolutionary in developing countries. For example, something like functioning rule of law, or something like a non-corrupt system. Or in the case of India, for a large part, having electricity almost the whole day. And that is fairly revolutionary in large parts of India as well. So a lot of entrepreneurs who came back from the Silicon Valley to India brought these ideas with them. And that helps develop capacity, both physical and institutional, in the country of origin. Some of the first returnees to India brought back with them these ideas, and they actually helped set up a lot of public-private partnerships. For example, something very simple. They started with the idea that if we want to have functioning industries, we need regular electricity. And one way of getting that, when the government has failed, is to have private generators to help with that. And this is where you often started seeing a public-private partnership in India. It was essentially private generators, but the government helped in getting permits and everything to get these things started. So that's how capacity is built, institutions are improved with the help of the diaspora. Saxenian, of course, uses this great term, the new Argonauts, of people who lived in a different country, then decided to come back to their country of origin, bringing with them great ideas, great skills, and so on. It is important to realize that in today's world, immigration or reverse immigration, neither of them actually have to be permanent. A lot of people have gone back to India or China, but after a few years they have decided to move back to their original or to their country of residence. And of course, part of that has to do with the fact that travel has become easier, but also most of these people often have permanent residence or citizenship in a different country. So it is much easier for them to travel back and forth. A term that you often hear when you interview some people like this is having the best of both worlds. So that is to a large extent what they often do. They shuttle back and forth between their countries of origin and their countries of residence. And in doing that, sort of help develop relations between the both of them. I'll quickly talk about why diasporas have an advantage when it comes to fostering trust. One of the terms that we use to explain this is the concept of homophily. And very briefly, what this means is all of us like to hang out with people who we think are like us. There are different bases of homophily. For example, one could be race, it could be religion, it could be ethnicity, it could be gender, it could be age. All of these are bases for homophily. Research reveals that there are different gradations, but race is one of the strongest bases for homophily. Gender typically tends to be the weakest basis for homophily. So essentially, people like to hang out with people who are like them. Ties between people who have ties of homophily form much quicker and dissolve at a slower rate than ties between cross-racial or cross-national groups. Because of that, trust is usually easier to engender between people of the same national or ethnic group. Also, as I talked about the rise of ethnic professional associations, because of ethnic professional associations, we actually have managers and entrepreneurs that are being trained in one country, but often are capable, very much capable of doing business in different countries because they probably have training at home and they have been trained in their country of residence. The people they are trained with often have moved between the two countries. So automatically, well, not automatically, but with quite a bit of work, these people often have access to social networks in both their country of origin and country of residence. And that is what makes trust easier to sort of engender in these situations. And finally, we have trust based on ascribed objectives, and this is in the country of origin. When we have someone from the original country, so for example, we have someone from China who lived in the United States but has now moved back to China to open a company or to open an NGO or whatever, chances are the level of trust that he or she has with the local community, in most cases, would be more than the level of trust the local community would have with the subsidiary of a foreign business or from a foreigner coming and operating in China. Because the objective that is often ascribed to returnees is that they want to do something to help their mother country. They often want to do something to help the village or the province they were from or the people they grew up with. So because of that, there is a greater level of trust that is ascribed to these individuals. So all of that sort of makes it easier for diasporas to actually foster trust and use this trust in driving trade and investment. Although I should make this clear that that by no means means that people not of the same ethnic group cannot have this trust. They can, they do. But it takes them more work and more effort to engender this trust than someone who is from the same national or ethnic background. I'll now look at some of the issues that diasporas are increasingly beginning to face. So I'll go through these fairly quickly. One of the first ones is the issue of identity, which is what actually is the diaspora and will it stay for long? For example, let's say we have a group of Indians living in the lower mainland. And a lot of you would say, well, yes, there are some groups of Indians very distinct, have a very distinct set of culture from the mainstream. Is that still true a generation later, or 2 or 3 generations later? So the point I'm trying to get at is there a time at which the diaspora essentially disappears and becomes no different from the mainstream group? And that's an important question to think about. If you take the case of the United States, sure, I mean, today we talk about Mexicans coming over and, setting up, for the want of a better word, ghettos in different parts where there's a different culture and everything. Fairly normal talking points for a lot of people. And the idea that a lot of people have is, well, that is a completely different culture. Should we actually allow it in? But the point is, if you go back in history, what you will see is a lot of other groups who had come to the United States at some point were often accused of the exact same thing, that these people could never become real Americans, for whatever that is. The same was said for the Irish, the Italians, and so on. And of course, today, a lot of people don't think that means much to be Irish American or whatever. So the whole point is being a diaspora permanent? Do you actually identify yourself as a diaspora? Do you identify yourself with 2 different cultures? Do you identify yourself with one culture? In cross-cultural studies, we use the concept of biculturalism to understand these issues. I won't go into too much detail on that, except that the basic idea is, do you see yourself as, let's say, Chinese, or do you see yourself as Canadian, or do you see yourself as Chinese Canadian? And what are the implications of that when it comes to building trust, or when it comes to driving trade? To go with that, I'll actually quickly move to point 4 here, because I think that's kind of more related. As governments try to engage their diasporas, I talked about India and China now very active in engaging the diasporas, it sort of might create a whole new dynamic in the country they are living in. the country that they are living in might start to question, are these really our people? Or are these essentially the people from a different country who just live here? So that's something for a diaspora to seriously think about. I mean, so far I've been looking at this from a very positive light, but it doesn't always have to be all positive. As countries of origin step up efforts to engage with the diaspora, does it actually in some ways hurt them in their countries of residence? And while a lot of us would like to think that it shouldn't have to be the case, the reality may actually be different. So this is something we really need to think about when it comes to the diaspora. Another important issue to consider is this. For a lot of the larger countries like China and India, there are vast regional differences within the country. So people from one region might be very different from people from another region. And when you are looking at it from 10,000 miles away, it might not make a difference. They might all seem exactly the same. But these differences do actually exist. And the question is, when these people come to a different country, do these differences actually disappear? Or do these differences actually still stay? And from the limited research we have, it seems that these differences do not actually go away when people move to a different country. For example, some research that I did with Dr. Rosalie Tang, we found that among Indian immigrants who are investing in India, Indian immigrants in the US and Canada who invest back in India, about 90% of the investment has gone back to their home states, not in any other state, but the state where they actually were from. We actually see fairly similar patterns with Chinese immigrants as well. So the different parts of China, what you would see is people from Hong Kong are more likely to invest in one particular part. People from Taiwan are often more likely to invest in another part. So essentially, from the limited research we have, we see that the cross-national differences do not go away, even when people move to a different country. So which brings in a completely different question, which is there actually one Indian diaspora or one Chinese diaspora? And of course, to a large extent there is, but are there serious differences between that one diaspora so that we need to study them to some extent separately? And finally, the different acculturation policies that countries of residence follow, does that have an impact on how diasporas behave in both countries? So for example, in a country like Canada, where the dominant philosophy has been multiculturalism, which is the idea that people are sometimes even encouraged to maintain their cultures from their country of origin, that provides or promotes a certain type of dynamic among immigrants. Let's say we think of a country which has a completely different approach to immigrants in its midst. And I'd say the country with the completely different approach, the best example would be a country like France, where the idea is that there is no other thing than a Frenchman or Frenchwoman. Either you are French or you are not. But there is supposedly, at least in theory, there is no such thing as an Algerian French or a Moroccan French. So everyone is basically one culture, one country. So on the one hand, we have this model of multiculturalism in Canada. On the other hand, we have this model of the strong melting pot in France. Whether that's successful or not is a different issue, but that's the philosophy. And do these two separate acculturation approaches make a difference as to how the diaspora sees itself as a part of the mother country or a part of the host country? And does that actually make a difference as to how they trade or set up ties between the two countries? So for example, does a society that practices multiculturalism, does it actually lead its immigrants to integrate quicker into mainstream society? Or does it actually lead them to stay separate? And I don't have the answer to this, but that's something we seriously need to think about when we talk about how diasporas drive trade and investment and ties between the different countries. So in conclusion, I'll say diasporas help foster trust between countries. They help drive trade and investment. In most cases, definitely not all, but in most cases, these benefits are positive for both the home and host countries. Because of their ethnic links that they often have in both their countries of origin and countries of residence, they can often serve as bridge builders or boundary spanners between the two countries. And essentially, if you look at the number of things that I talked about, the cross-national networks, homophily, the increasing number of people who are shuttling back and forth, the degree of trust that is extended to people who return, we can conclude that diasporas have been an effective conduit for trade and investment. And that is something that will be one of the drivers of international business in the next few years. So with that, I'll stop here, and I look forward to your questions. Go ahead.
Question, I guess people come from another origin country over time, all those aspects tend to disappear, I think. Is that what you find? Or is there some maintenance of that connection, of that feeling, or is it?
I would say it varies across different groups. One thing we do see is there is often some level of ties with the home country. So it could be having people back home that you talk to regularly, or people that you know, and so on. Obviously, as you say, over time, these ties tend to weaken. And it might not be during, let's say, my time or your time. Probably children and children of children probably have less of these ties. So just these ties occasionally do, or over time, do weaken. But as I said, governments are now being very active in trying to promote these ties. Again, ties that have often been weakened over time. Can they strengthen it again? So I would say that's a question we need to look at, because we are seeing it practically right now as we speak. As to ties weaken over time, but can governments foster these ties again? So we have a life experiment actually going on now.
Yeah, I find your thought, business is not my field. I am interested in diaspora and religion. But I'm working on a paper right now that looks at religion, Chinese diaspora, and multicultural policy in Canada. And it seems to me that there's an interesting shift taking place in terms of the way multiculturalism is now being framed by Minister Kenny and his staff. The language is really changing, and it seems to me that he may actually unwittingly be undermining the potential trade strengths and business strengths that diaspora communities seem to have associated with them, as you can argue. I'll just quote something briefly here from, he gave a talk at University of Western Ontario in March 2009, and he quoted some work by Andrew Cohen. He's a journalist who wrote a book called The Unfinished Canadian. And he quotes, Minister Kenny quotes saying how he deplores the way Canada is becoming, in the words of the novelist Yann Martel, the greatest hotel on earth. Cohen believes that Canada is becoming a residence of convenience that expects virtually nothing in return for one of the easiest passports in the world to acquire. So he's positioning himself in fairly aggressive tones there vis-a-vis people who would be interested in migrating to Canada and contributing to its economic vitality. I wonder if you'd just like to share any comments or observations about Canada's shifting multiculturalism policy relative to our business opportunities and the way new Canadians are being perceived. I find it a little troubling, actually.
Recently, I was reading a report about how different countries have different policies for immigrants and how difficult or easy it is to get a passport, and are there any restrictions on citizens who become citizens that move overseas, and how all of that plays into actually integrating people into society. And of course, the integration is a word different people define differently. Honestly, I don't remember who wrote the report, but the findings I thought were very interesting. It was looking at a whole range of acculturation policies, Canada being on one end, France being on the other end. And what they found was the two countries that, in their definition, who had been the best at integrating people in their midst actually were Canada and France. The two countries that had the most opposite policies, strongly multiculturalism or strongly melting pot, but most countries in the middle tend to have more problems. So, I don't know, I mean, that's one report I read that made me think, and I can see why there's a lot of pressure to move from such a, what some would call a liberal immigration policy into maybe demanding more from immigrants. But the limited evidence I have seen is multiculturalism seems to have served Canada fairly well. And if you look across countries, unless we move to a completely strong melting pot policy of France, I would say, I don't think why change something that seems to be working well.
Yeah. Of course, it's tied to the investor class migration with its $800,000 price tag, right?
It used to be 500,000, has it gone?
Yeah, I think it's gone up again. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. There are 2 points. One is I was reading recently, Easterly, David Easterly, the well-known fellow. He wrote that in the States, in US, that there is more corruption where there are more ethnic groups. Say 200 years, 100 years ago, US was the WASP country. And as in many areas, other ethnic groups have come. And he says that where there is a predominance of ethnic groups, he cited a number of states in the US, then there is more corruption. Maybe that is one of the negative things about. The other is today's newspaper, Globe and Mail, talking about Vancouver Foundation. I don't know if you know of it or not. It says that now there is less social capital here due to the various ethnic groups. We don't have, I see, we don't have the block parties that we used to have. Where you have the same sort of people. Now there they are, they're getting together and they all drink and they all eat the same thing, so we don't have that sort of social trust. We don't have the same sort of mixing as we used to have it. And this was today's newspaper. Actually, was it the very first headline in the newspaper? Another negative aspect of the diaspora.
I'll quickly make a couple of points. I mean, when it comes to the question of corruption, you're right. I mean, I've seen that report as well, which was that in the United States, places where there are more immigrants, they, on some indices, they actually rank higher on corruption. Now, personally, I wouldn't be too surprised, let me put it this way, because a lot of immigrants are coming from countries where the value system is different. In a lot of cases, what is considered corruption in the West might not even be considered corruption in the country. It might simply be considered a case of building ties. So I wouldn't be too surprised about that. I'll quickly though add that over the last few years, the United States has been going down quite a bit on the corruption index, the Transparency International Corruption Index, very widely known. I think in the latest manifestation, the United States was ranked below Qatar when it came to corruption, so maybe something to think about. Second point you make about the social capital of immigrants and how maybe some of them are living separate lives or something. I think that's a very serious issue to consider. I personally believe, and a lot of people might not agree with me, but I do personally believe that there is something we in Canada have not paid as much attention to as we should. Robert Putnam had this great work about social capital where he talked about bonding capital versus raising capital. So bonding capital being the ties that people form between people like themselves, in this case the same ethnic group. Bridging capital being ties that people form with people other than themselves, like these different ethnic groups. And definitely multiculturalism does foster strong bonding capital because people often live with people like them. But the question is, does it foster strong bridging capital? And there are strong arguments on both sides, and people are, I think it is an open debate as to which side is stronger. But definitely the idea of, I think everyone agrees that we don't want to be a country of ethnic ghettos. And is that the direction we are going into? Or I've seen other studies that say, well, ethnic ghettos are, and it's an easy word to use or easy phrase to use, but in reality, the most successful immigrant groups that we have, they started out living separately, and over time they moved into the mainstream. So maybe that is the reason why people are successful, because they start out living among themselves, and over time, because of the strong ties in community, in their ethnic community, they manage to move up. So actually, these are the two sides of the debate. It's an ongoing debate, but something to be seriously considered.
But unless you agree with the question. Unless you agree.
I don't think you asked.
I think you did a question.
I have a question, yes. I wonder what you recommend we should do about a situation where immigrant groups, diaspora groups, come here and pursue objectives which are illegal in their homeland but not here. I think, for example, of the Khalistan movement of the Sikhs who came here, or the Tamil Tigers who came here. They came in groups, but most of what they were doing was not illegal in Canada, but was in their homeland and created great difficulties, tension between the homeland country and Canada. And now, somewhat related, is there are now quite a few economic criminals from China who make a lot of money in China and then come here and park the money and come here, and they're not breaking any laws in Canada, but they're wanted as criminals back home. There's one more prominent one, but they're a lot like him from China. So what should we be doing about this problem?
Well, in a lot of cases, honestly, this goes down to how important are the countries these people are coming from. Historically, these things happened all the time. We didn't pay any attention to that. The issue of Tamil Tigers funding what Sri Lanka calls terror has been going on not for 2 or 3 years, but Sri Lanka has said it's gone on for 30 years. Canada didn't think much about it because it didn't really care. And honestly, Sri Lanka wasn't very important a country. The balance of global power is changing. So in the case of China and India, I would say we have to balance the rights that we give to citizens versus the importance of other countries.
I just have one observation and one comment. First observation is that I think government policy drives everything else, where things change according to how government sees its position in the world economy. So as competition grows, policy changes. Most more geared towards the economic development of that particular country. Second is one of diaspora, African diaspora. I'm more familiar with that. When you talk about African diaspora, people will go back to the slavery time, And the African Union tried to capitalize on this by incorporating Africans of so-called African diaspora in Brazil and Latin America and Caribbean as being part of the African Union and providing them with special status. But this hasn't gone very far because of the fact that people don't identify themselves as being African anymore. They're more Brazilian and more than African, so this is one. And the Africans themselves try to broaden the gap of being African diaspora is problematic in that Africa is very heterogeneous. It's not homogeneous like India or China. So we find a lot of problems. People identify themselves as Ghanaians or South Africans rather than general broad of Africans. So the African Union is also finding problems trying to recruit African diaspora to work for the overall African objectives. So I think they should limit themselves to nationalistic approaches, recruiting Swazis to go to Swaziland or Nigerians to go to Nigeria rather than generalize that Nigerians can go to anywhere in Africa, which becomes problematic. You also alluded to the asset value of the diaspora, let's say in Canada, and their contribution to the policy to the projects of the Canadian government, for example. In your study, have you found any evidence that these diaspora are being incorporated more in the programs of the countries of residence, in programs by going back to the countries of origin to promote, let's say, for Canadian or American programs? Because I found that doesn't happen at all. Despite the fact that you've alluded to there's that positive relationship between the diaspora and the country of origin. But governments are not taking advantage of that. Why is that?
A couple of questions. I'll try to get to them in order. The first question I think you asked was about how governments would react to diasporas coming in, engaging in different activities. And I'll talk about this from the perspective of Canada, because one of the things Canada needs to realize is that yes, we are an immigrant nation. We have lots of people who come in and live in Canada from different countries. But Canada also has a huge diaspora overseas, and that often gets overlooked. So for a lot of major countries, utilizing the diaspora might be a two-way street. So for example, if you think of Canada, Canada's diaspora by some estimates is about 3.5 million people. To put that into perspective, it is larger than the population of all but 4 provinces. Spread out all over the world, about 40% in the United States, the next biggest concentration being in Hong Kong. But in a lot of cases, it is a two-way thing. I mean, you need to engage your diaspora overseas as a strategic asset. But you also need to realize that people coming in from different countries, they can help you build bridges with those countries. Is it always positive? No, it's not. I mean, we like to think that all these things are 100% positive, but they're not always positive. As I think Ambassador Drake made the point, a lot of people who come here could be criminals in their own countries. Does that hurt our ties with those countries? Absolutely, it does. So it is a matter of finding the right balance between attracting the right skilled people you're looking for, but also at the same time paying attention to the world of real politics, where things might not always be ideal. Second point about the African diaspora that you were talking about. I'm actually doing a study, not reflected here, but I'm doing a study with the co-author who often goes to and collects information of the Democratic Republic of Congo. So, as you can realize, there are not too many places in the world where collecting information is more difficult. But we have managed to collect some information. One of the things that drives off so many Africans in helping their motherland, more than anything else I'd say, is the issue of corruption. There is no certainty as to what happens with the money they bring back to their home country. My co-author was giving me an example, and he's very active in diaspora African circles. He recently opened a clinic in his hometown. He opened it after 10 years because the first time he tried to open the clinic, he had a local partner who he gave money to and he ran away with the money. And even though he knows who the person is and where he lives, he actually tried going through the legal process, but nothing has happened. In fact, he says the lawyer I hired to do this, he keeps calling me and saying he's sick, so I should send him some money. So to a large extent, that's reality. As to the other question, is there any evidence that a lot of people going back are promoting the interests of their country of residence? In my research, I haven't seen them doing that exclusively. What I've seen is, in a lot of cases, in most cases, the interests of the country of residence and the country of origin tend to be on the same thing. One of the things a lot of governments are beginning to realize is what's called the entrepreneurial approach to diaspora management. So if you want to engage your diaspora overseas, it is not sufficient to simply talk about patriotism and do this for your motherland because, you're one of us, that sort of thing. The much more effective diaspora management techniques have been from countries that have combined that with solid economic incentives, which is that if you come and invest in your country of origin, there is good business to be done, and both sides can profit. So we should, most important thing is we should not get into the mindset that we go into the motherland to help her while making a loss ourselves. I know that is not popular with a lot of people, but there is money to be made in helping the homeland and helping people there. The two are not mutually exclusive. Business and helping people are definitely not mutually exclusive, and countries are beginning to realize that. So that's
Then I've noticed that two different groups of diaspora. One is blue collar immigrants. For example, countries like India, there are a lot of people are working in Middle East as in construction site and the other group is, and those people are coming back anyway, and another groups are coming back from the Western world, especially America, and those are highly educated and then, they are coming as a country manager and as for multinational companies and all. So how do we, understand these two different groups and affect this local economy?
In the case of India, the answer is pretty simple. India has dealt with these two groups very differently. It has laid out the red carpet for Western returning. And to be honest, it doesn't do much for the other group. The government of India will disagree with me, but people who have lived in the Middle East, the blue-collar workers that you're referring to, I have known quite a few of them. I've been in the Middle East, and honestly, they get very little, any help from the government when things go bad. And the situation is pretty bad for them because if you follow the news from the Middle East, scarcely a day goes by without hearing the abuses that a lot of migrant workers from India and also places like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Philippines face. Most Middle Eastern countries have no real labor laws or enforcement to speak of. And you talk to the migrant workers involved, most of them will tell you the government doesn't do much to help. Is it beginning to change? Yes. In the year 2000, India commissioned a report about its diaspora. And one of the recommendations was India needs to be much more active in promoting the interests of its workers. It is beginning to happen. But essentially, India's approach has been lay out the red carpet for the returnees from the West. And if you have any resources left over, we'll look after the Middle Eastern workers. While I do not know much about other countries who face this, my guess would be the situation will not be too much different. I don't know this for sure.
Hey, one more question. When we talk of diaspora, we generally say about growth, but we don't talk much about development in the sense of promoting democracy, promoting gender equality, reducing violence against women, promoting tolerance, things like this, which perhaps it may not cost very much to the diaspora to do these things when they go. So most of these countries that the diaspora come from, poor countries, say dysfunctional countries, there are Somalis here, things like this. And it would change so much the lives of ordinary people back, say, in the country of origin, if the diaspora was put a lot of effort, say, on promoting development.
Above and beyond economic growth.
Yeah, yeah.
And once more, I would say this, that I think things are changing slowly, but they are changing. Historically, I would say the diaspora couldn't do much about the development aspect simply because it was difficult to maintain ties back home to the same extent that they can do it now. Personally, I do agree with you that in a lot of cases, the diaspora has done a lot for economic growth, but not as much when it comes to issues of social justice, maybe. I do agree with that. I think we are seeing a small change in that, partly because it is easier to keep in touch, partly because the diaspora, I think, is becoming more socially conscious. But there is definitely a lot more to be done in that. I would say I'm cautiously optimistic. That's all I'm saying with that.
One challenge for this, can I say, diaspora for this economic growth of that particular country is that I read one newspaper article in India, and they mentioned that Indian diaspora's money, we call it NRI, non-residential Indians' money, usually boost this real estate business only, and they are coming to that area and increase that land price only, and it is not, to other industries. And how do you say that?
And I would say, until a few years ago, that was absolutely right. The money that NRIs were sending was essentially to build their family newer houses, buy new property around the bigger cities, and there was, and there still is, tremendous property price inflation in not the city itself, but the suburbs surrounding Delhi and Bombay. We are seeing explosive growth in property prices. A large amount of that is driven by money that the diaspora is sending. I would say it's slowly changing in certain directions. One of the things that I know is a lot more money is now going into those suburbs, and I call them suburbs, they are not called suburbs there, but these new developments. A lot of money is actually going into retail, supermarkets, all of that, by the way, linked to the property price increase. So there's a lot of money going into retail. On a different side, there is quite a bit of money, obviously, that's flowing into the high-tech sector. So I would say there is that aspect of land development that has moved beyond simple, bigger houses that a lot of money is going into, and there is the high-tech area the money is going into. So it has expanded a little, but you're right. I mean, when it comes to manufacturing, there is almost no, I wouldn't say no, but there's very little money in India coming from the diaspora that goes into manufacturing. So that's something definitely to think about if the government can do something in public-private partnership and so on.
Well, if there are no further questions,
Thank you very much.
thank you, Dr. Chen, for a wonderful, interesting presentation. So don't go away yet. We have a small souvenir. It's very wonderful, actually, to welcome back the alumnus of SFU.
Well, it's great to be back to the school that taught me most of the
Yes.
time.
So we have a souvenir for you. We're proudly.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know if everybody, my name is Paul Crow. I direct the Lebanese Center. I think I know pretty much everybody here. Before we conclude, I just wanted to draw your attention to another business-related presentation that's coming up on the 29th of November through the Jack Austin Center for Asia Pacific Business in the Bene School of Business here at SFU. So this is a talk by Colin Hawes, Dr. Colin Hawes, who's a research fellow at the Jack Austin Center. Colin Hawes is interested in the intersection between business, law, and culture, and has published numerous articles in those areas. Now, his talk is going to be titled, How to Be a Good Chinese CEO, corporate leadership with Chinese characteristics. So it promises to be a very interesting discussion. So if you need information right after, I can give you there's an email, RSVP. All right. Well, I'd like to say thank you to you all for coming, and of course to Professor Hope for ongoing efforts in making the forum a success for so many years, and always being able to find such interesting, engaging speakers. So thanks again for coming.